You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week, we're joined by Sujata Srivastava, Chief Policy Officer at SPUR, to discuss a recent policy brief entitled The Next 100 Days, an Urbanist Decision-Making Framework for San Francisco's New Mayor, about downtown recovery, transit, and resilience. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super wonderful, terrific, amazing Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of city wizards and transportation experts, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. We've also got some bonus material up there, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, the heavyweight net bike scarf is back in stock. I'm also going to make a concerted effort to make some new designs, but if you want to get one of the Buster Bike scarves or the Lightweight Bike scarf now, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. And if you'd like to support the show in other ways, you can buy books at the bookshop site, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire, or find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarcholesterol. For anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook, visit theoverheadwire.com and definitely sign up for the almost 20-year-old daily newsletter. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that too. You can also find us on Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's Transit Nerds. Some great stuff coming up, so keep on listening and enjoy the show. A quick note for Patreon supporters. I've set up an ad-free podcast RSS feed at Patreon. This means if you want to listen to the show without ads or promotional episodes in your podcatcher of choice, you can do so by heading over to your Patreon account and getting the feed there. I'll post instructions in the show notes of how to do it. And if you aren't a Patreon supporter, you can do so by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Even just $1 a month gets you our podcast free of outside ads. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Well, Sujata Srivastava, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here live in the studio. We appreciate you being here. Before you get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I am the Chief Policy Officer at SPUR. We're a public policy organization that does urban planning, research, and advocacy. My background's in city planning. For a very long time, I worked at consulting firms that looked at the urban economics component of how we build cities. And now I am really enthusiastic about putting a lot of those ideas into practice.
So what got you interested in cities or planning or anything along those lines?
Well, I was in college in the 90s, dating myself. And
I was too, at the end of the 90s.
And you might remember how much was happening with like discussion about urban issues. And it was actually very much pathologizing what was going on in public housing and what was going on in cities like LA. And I took some classes about urban studies and urban politics, they were called, in college. And I just got really captivated by thinking about this as a complex connection between place and sociology and economy. Like it's such an interdisciplinary way of thinking about the world and connections and how it affects people's daily lives that's really what drew me to that. And then once I realized like, oh, urban planning is a thing. It's like a profession. You can actually build skills and look at this a little bit more deeply and not just be theory, but practice. That also was really compelling to me.
I feel like a lot of people come to planning from that direction where they're like, oh, this is a thing I can do, right? This is a job I can have. Because that's how I came to it. I had no idea. Initially, I was trying to get into kinesiology so I could be like a track coach or something. But then I got into geography, took a class on cities, and then I was like, oh, this is exciting. And then a person sitting next to me in one of my classes was like, you can do this as a profession. And I was like, really? This is awesome. I feel like a lot of us come to it that way, which is funny because, everybody's impacted by city planning and cities and transportation and urban policy, but it's something that doesn't really kind of show itself until later in studies and in school.
Yeah, and I think it can be kind of invisible, right? You're just kind of like going about your life and you're not thinking about what are all the things that made this possible.
Right. Well, so we also worked together for a lot of years on a number of TOD-related projects, but perhaps you can share a little bit more with folks about what you worked on before you came to SPUR. You mentioned some of that, but I want to hear a little bit more.
So right before I was working at SPUR, I was at Strategic Economics. which was part of this Center for Transit-Oriented Development partnership that you and I worked on TOD studies together. Strategic Economics is a boutique firm that does consulting mostly with public agencies like cities and transit agencies, sometimes regional governments, and looks at what are some of the market and feasibility and economic factors that guide development and planning and communities. My personal expertise was more on looking at affordable housing strategies. So how do you leverage the market to be able to create more affordability? How do you design community benefit agreements so that communities are getting what is really needed out of new development? And then when is it actually not appropriate to ask new development to pay for these things that really should be more distributed? And then I also did a lot of work on economic development and small business strategies. And the firm was really focused on this idea of growing in infill locations. So all of our work was really with that orientation. So Dina Belzer, the president, was one of the, I think, initial Congress for New Urbanists people, and also had this ideology behind the practice. And so we did a lot of work nationally on facilitating, planning for, and implementing transit-oriented communities.
Do you have a favorite project from that time period?
Oh, that's a good question. There are two projects that kind of stick with me. One was a BRT corridor in Connecticut for the Knowledge Corridor. And that was interesting because it was a corridor in a part of the country that is not growing, it's actually shrinking, and aging. And thinking about what does it mean to have a transit-oriented development strategy in a place that's actually sprawling and not growing. And so what it was really focused on was like the anchor institutions. There's a lot of major employers. There's a insurance industry cluster. There are hospitals and universities. And so that was really the basis for thinking about what opportunities were for being able to concentrate development and create the best benefit out of the transit system. And also BRT, something that is really different from the rail strategies that we typically see in other places. And then the other one that I really learned a lot from was Charlotte. They were really trying to look at what were the opportunities to create more affordability. They had actually been very successful at developing along their transit corridor. But what they realized afterwards was that they hadn't really had any guardrails around that to make sure that they were getting affordable housing and preserving sites for affordability. So as they were expanding, they wanted to learn from those mistakes and figure out how they could do it better in a more inclusive way.
Those are two very different places, right? There's a low, slow, not growing place and a high growth place. I mean, Charlotte's a very high growing place.
Yeah.
And so that's interesting because you bring that to like San Francisco, which is definitely a place that's growing, but also it has its struggles because of post-pandemic stuff. And so I'm wondering if there's anything from any of those projects you took with you. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff you took with you, but...
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the narrative for me when we think about San Francisco, specifically the city of San Francisco, in this moment where office vacancies are at 35%, even higher, depending on what data source you're using. It's pretty similar to places like Hartford, Connecticut that have struggled to attract office tenants. It's not the same because we have the job base and we have the talent, and we have a lot of growth in those ways, but it's similar in terms of like, how do you rethink spaces? And it's also like a mindset shift because other places have had to really be strategic about how they market themselves and like what kinds of investments they're making to attract private money. And in San Francisco, I think they've had the luxury of not having to think about it that way for a very, very long time. And so there's something to learn from those places about like, well, what are the kinds of strategies that actually make sense? What are the types of investments that are needed? And what's the role of the public sector to be able to turn a place around?
Yeah. I want to ask you about SPUR to start with. I mean, we've had folks on from SPUR a lot of times before, but for folks that might not be familiar around the country with what SPUR is, can you give us kind of a background on how SPUR was founded, what SPUR is, the history, but also like what you all are working on now?
So SPUR's been around for over 100 years. It was actually founded post-1906 earthquake as a civic organization of volunteers who wanted to rebuild the city. And I think it was called the San Francisco Housing Association when it was first started. And it has evolved. It was initially San Francisco, and now it is a regional organization because we know that housing and planning and transportation and sustainability, all of those things are regional issues. So in the 2010s, they opened a San Jose office and an Oakland office. So we now have a 3-city perspective. We also do a lot of work for the 9-county Bay Area region. And we are about policy research, education, and advocacy. So I think that that's one thing that's unique about SPUR is we're not purely a think tank that's publishing research. We're also doing a lot of on-the-ground advocacy, and we're doing as much community building around urbanism as we can. And we have 5 policy areas that we work in: planning, housing, transportation, sustainability and resilience, and governance. And each of those policy areas has big initiatives. Some of them are at the local scale, some of them are at the regional scale.
So I also wanted to talk with you about where we are right now in San Francisco. I mentioned it a little bit, the post-pandemic malaise, but there's a lot of ink spilled nationally about us. And I just want to know kind of realistically, like what are some of the issues that we're coming up against here in the city versus maybe what people think we're up against from the outside?
Yeah, I think San Francisco does have challenges around the transformation of how people work and move in the city. Everything has been focused on downtown in terms of like the transportation networks and the job concentration in San Francisco. And with hybrid work, it still remains the largest employment center and where most people work. But I think we are at about 50% of the, daytime visitation that we used to have in office buildings. And tourism has taken a pretty big hit, most of that because of some of the restrictions, particularly in Asia. And so both of those things were actually what made the downtown work in terms of having a lot of support for small businesses and retail. When you think about Union Square and how that operates, it's really based on office and tourism. So those shifts have been pretty stark in San Francisco because San Francisco was actually kind of a successful urban center in some ways, right? It had that density, it had that focus. And so it's more disruptive in a place like San Francisco than it would be in a place like Atlanta, where things are much more distributed. I think those issues still have to be grappled with. And at the same time, a lot of the problems in San Francisco predate the pandemic. So, the income inequality and the unhoused, those issues are just sort of amplified, I think, by recent trends. But we know that there were a lot of things that weren't working super well with downtown, that it was not really serving the needs of a lot of people, and that it was too dependent on some specific industries. And so there wasn't really a lot of resilience built into the system.
We'll get to that in a second. I have a whole batch of questions related to downtown and what's happening there. But we just had an election, and we elected a new mayor. Mayor Lurie has done some stuff in the first 100 days. You all basically put together this brief that looks at, well, what should we do with the next 100 days? And when I read it, I felt like this could be for any mayor, really, because it's the issues that San Francisco is always going to be focused on. Can you talk a little bit about like where the brief came from and the idea behind the timelines of like 100 days and moving forward with some recommendations from that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the idea of a new administration is that it offers an opportunity to look at things a little bit differently and make change. If you have an administration like this one, I think the entire platform has been about changing the way that the city operates. And so we looked at this as an opportunity to put forth a lot of the ideas that have been developed by SPUR for a long time. So these are not new ideas. It's just a framework for being able to focus over the next 100 days. So the first 100 days are about, okay, here I am. I'm going to learn about the city. I'm going to figure out how things work. And the next 100 days is an opportunity for like, okay, well, how are you going to prioritize? And because we know there's so much chaos at the federal level, it's really hard for city workers, city department heads to be able to not just be putting out fires.
Yeah.
And we think it's important for SPUR to play that role of just shining a light on what we think is the most important thing to be advancing and not to let that falter just because of all the chaos. We started when we wrote the paper with this idea of governance and what does it take to make the city be able to respond to the needs that are currently facing it. And then once you have the right structures in place, it's much easier for you to be able to implement some of the other elements.
So what does the governance structure of San Francisco kind of look like in the way that you wish that it would function?
Well, it's super complicated because it's a city and county, so it's unique. Like, it's hard to compare San Francisco to any other place in California.
Yeah.
And also, like, over the decades, the city has become even more complex in the way that it's structured, and the authority to make decisions has been distributed in many, many ways. So we don't really have a purely strong mayor form of government. We have a board of supervisors. The idea of a board of supervisors is they do the county stuff. That's not really how it works when you have a combined city-county. And then we have city administrator. Well, most cities either have a city administrator or a strong mayor. And we have this sort of like mix of things. And it can be really hard to know who's really in charge. The other problem is that I think there are either 54 or 56 departments under the mayor's office.
That's a lot
no
of
single mayor. Yeah.
56.
Like imagine if you had 54 direct reports. How would you actually be able to manage that complexity? And I think over the years, because there's been concern about like, oh, we don't want the mayor to be too powerful. We want to make sure that our supervisors are able to do things in their little districts. It just has diluted that even more. We also have commissions and task forces in the city that actually have quite a bit of authority to hire and fire people, to make really big strategic decisions. And so when something goes wrong as a resident, it would be really hard for you to know, well, who's responsible for that? Is it this amorphous board of supervisors? Is it the mayor? Is it some random commission that I don't even really know about? And so part of what needs to happen is just a streamlining of that decision-making authority and clearer lines of responsibility so that everybody knows, okay, if there's an issue with this development project, it's not proceeding, the permitting is broken, I know who's ultimately responsible for that.
Who wins in this system? Like ultimately, like who benefits from this?
Well, it's a system that benefits the people who know how to navigate it.
Right.
And that's not equitable because it's not transparent, right? So if you are an insider, you can figure out how to do the workarounds. It also, I think, when you have a lot of bureaucracy, it can actually create more opportunity for corruption. Because it's about cutting through the red tape. And sometimes for good reasons, like the outcome that you're trying to seek might be a good outcome. But the only way to do it is by ducking the system. And so you don't want to create a system that's so complicated that the only way for people to get things done is to skip a bunch of steps.
Yeah. You also bring up procurement. I think procurement is kind of understated as a way to achieve a lot of goals. Like we had folks on from Europe to talk about Oslo, Rotterdam, Copenhagen, and how they're working on procurement systems to make their cities more sustainable. And so you can use procurement as a way to achieve your goals. And so I'm curious how that helps us if we can figure out like all these things that we purchase, all these services that we acquire, all of these things. People probably don't even realize like how much money we spend on little things, staples, but we can actually like achieve our goals through that as well. In addition to the restructuring of the government itself, there's things like procurement.
Yeah.
Go a long way.
Yeah, and it's $1 out of every $3 in the city's budget that goes towards procuring goods and services. And that's everything from, building something to contracting IT services. And yeah, you're right. I mean, it's a powerful tool, the good purchasing movement of just making sure that you are spending dollars in a way that is ethical and brings other benefits to the city. Those are really important pieces of it. We also have to make sure that the system isn't so complicated that it is creating additional costs and burdens on the vendors and nonprofits that are delivering those services. So right now, it takes generally anywhere from 9 months to 18 months to get under contract. It's extremely expensive, whether it's like a $20,000 contract or a $2 million contract. It takes a tremendous amount of resources to just get somebody under contract, not to mention all the things that happen after somebody's on contract. Is the city reimbursing them on time for the services that they're providing? If you're a small nonprofit and you're just maybe providing meals to your community, you need to know that you're not going to be in the red trying to do that and that the city's going to reimburse you on time. You also want to know what the process is for getting under contract and that the goalposts aren't going to shift. Because if they are, then as good as you are at providing that service, you might decide it's not worth it. It takes too long, and even though you're the best contractor for the job, you don't have the resources to go through all of that mess. So I think the intentions behind the procurement processes have been, generally good. We want to make sure that we have the right rules in place and that we are achieving certain kinds of outcomes that we think are important, social objectives that we might have as a city. But when you actually translate that into the process, if it's taking that long for somebody to get under contract, and if there's no assurance of like how they're going to be evaluated for their performance and how they're going to get paid, then it's really creating a problem for actually achieving the outcomes that you're hoping to get. So what we have in our report is some suggestions about how the city actually needs to do some real soul searching around what are the objectives that are appropriate to try to achieve through procurement. There's certain kinds of things that are outside of the city's control in terms of social objectives. And so trying to integrate them into the procurement process might be really hard, even though the Board of Supervisors thinks that these are important things to try to do. So you got to be realistic about what you can actually achieve through procurement and simplify the process.
It feels like, when we used to talk about TOD all the time, it was always like we're asking TOD to do too much.
Right.
It sounds like you could also do that for procurement too, where you're like, oh, well, all of the trucks in your fleet have to be electric if you provide this service, or you have to do this and this and this in order to provide us this service. Even though those goals are laudable, it can be overly complicated. And it also feels like it would benefit incumbents, people that already have the contracts to start with, and keep out competition.
That's right. I mean, there are times when they only get one or two vendors going for things because it's too hard and you have to know how to navigate the system.
Yeah. What is this trust-based accountability that you all have brought into the paper?
There are a lot of media stories all the time about some city employee that did something wrong. And so, therefore, let's create a whole new process on top of what we already have.
Build a whole new widget to let people get through. Yeah.
And on our report, we have this illustration of a maze. And so you just build out a new section of the maze. Instead of just clarifying the maze, then there's less opportunity for somebody to go around the rules. I think what we also sometimes underappreciate is that most of the time when people break rules, they get caught. The system does catch them. And so it's not just about preventing anything from happening, but about capacity building for the city staff and the vendors so that they understand. There's so many different ways to get under contract right now that city staff don't actually know what the best way is for them to bring in a vendor. And that's a problem. So then on the vendor side, train them on here's what you're going to have to do to be able to get under contract. Here's what we're going to be expecting you during the term of the contract. This is how we're going to be auditing or evaluating you at the end of the contract or through the contract. And that doesn't actually exist in a consistent basis right now. So a trust-based accountability system would be everybody knows the rules. Everybody has the same information and they can kind of go through that process. If something goes wrong, there are still mechanisms to capture that, but you're not designing the whole system for that, 1 to 3% of potential bad actors. Because there's always going to be some bad actors.
Yeah.
But you don't need to necessarily assume that everybody is a bad actor. I think most people who do this kind of work have the best motives.
It just made me think of the jury duty selection process for San Francisco. I went maybe in the last 6 months anyways, I went. And then, they bring you into a room and then you have to watch this video about bias, which is a really good video, by the way. And just having that kind of system seems to work. Going in, watching the video, making sure everybody's on the same page before you are chosen or not chosen. And, then everybody knows what their responsibilities are. Feels like something similar would be beneficial for procurement or for, getting people on board. It also made me think of a story of how San Francisco County lost my marriage license.
Oh, no. That seems important.
It is important. It was crazy because when Nancy and I got married, we did it in Lafayette. And then we had my sister and my friend sign to make sure that there's witnesses. And then I brought it to the city and I turned it in, right? And then when I came back to get the license because I needed it for something, they're like, well, we can't find it. And I was like, I know you got it. I have a page that says you received it. I got a receipt from you, basically. It says you received it on this date. And they're like, well, we don't have it. So you need to go and get these things signed again. Well, we're not all in the same place. I need to get this signed before next week or it expires, the whole thing.
Oh, wow.
And so just little things like that, frustrating. And I know that, that has nothing to do with procurement or anything like that, but just San Francisco's intake process and all that sometimes can be frustrating.
Yeah, and you think about the most vulnerable people are the ones who rely on government the most for essential services and for social benefits, and they're the ones who have to navigate these really complicated processes. And so, if you really want to make a difference in people's lives, it's a really good place to do these reforms.
Yeah, make it simple.
Make it simple.
Okay, so reimagining downtown. The pandemic has taken a substantial chunk out of our office workers, which means less businesses in the area as well as transit ridership. But it's always been kind of a risk because of our heavy reliance, as you mentioned, on tourism and employment in office space. So what are some of these headwinds that are going against downtown and what are some of the possible solutions?
I think the biggest headwinds are just that it takes a really long time to change places. And we don't really have a lot of the tools and resources that have existed in other times in California's history to be able to do big transformations. And, we used to have redevelopment agencies, which were not perfect at all, but they had authority and tools to be able to transform places. And it's not really just a downtown San Francisco issue. It's like downtowns all over, but especially in San Francisco where you had such a high density of jobs and kind of a unique economic structure. I think we really can use this as an opportunity to diversify downtown, make it more inclusive of small businesses, affordable housing, arts and culture. There's like a lot of stuff that wasn't really there in the before times, but that requires some financial resources and some land use authority and some governance, like some streamlined decision making to be able to make that happen. And so those are some of the ways that we've been thinking about it, is like, what are the kinds of financing, governance, land use authority that are needed to be able to face this magnitude of a challenge? Because you got, 35 million square feet of space, some of which may get re-tenanted, but it'll take a very long time. And so what do you do in the next 5 to 10 years? I think this is where the public sector has an important role to play, because I think the private sector on its own will not fix this problem in the short term. It's going to take decades, really.
Their incentives are off, it feels like.
Yeah. And I think the other headwinds, of course, are just tariffs and all of the other federal economic policies that are making it harder for all kinds of development to happen and for all kinds of infrastructure investments to happen.
Is it also hard to get attention on doing the little things when you have this want to bring a big project or make a big splash? Like, I know that Mayor Breed was like talking about like building a soccer stadium downtown, which I think is a silly idea, but it made like a headline in the paper. And so I'm wondering what the trade-offs are of trying to make this big, splashy headline generating idea versus like doing the little things that will bring people back a little bit at a time, but it will be more sustainable over time.
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like some of the stuff around just making it easier for small businesses to operate downtown that are just like system changes, those are things that can apply regardless of who that small business is. And in the same way, I've been taking this approach of like, we can have lots of use cases, but like, what is the system that's needed to hold that so that you can have a responsiveness to if a soccer team wants to be downtown, maybe there's a way to make that happen. Or if a university wants to come downtown, or if there's some other kind of big anchor that wants to be downtown. I think you can design these tools and these structures and build the capacity of city staff to be able to respond to any one of those use cases if you have the right things in place, if you have the right ingredients in place.
Yeah. Before, we also did something like tax breaks for mid-market and stuff like that, where we were focusing on specific parts of the city or specific entities that might come in. For example, Twitter came to that space. And so, it's, as you mentioned in the report, better to not focus on those things that we did in the past because it was too focused on one group versus maybe making it more generalized, as you just mentioned, for a larger group, like small businesses. It's really hard to get into a storefront. Like, there's a place up the street just here in Noe Valley that's like been empty for the last 10 years. And part of it is just because of like how expensive it is to actually rent a place. I mean, people are sitting on Prop 13 gold, but also just like getting your permits to open a place.
Yeah, we wrote a paper about small businesses in San Francisco called Small and Mighty that kind of highlighted that exact issue. Like, if the permitting process is so complicated, again, it's just the same thing as that procurement system. There's very few entrepreneurs that know how to cut through all of that. I think that the city's done a pretty good job at trying to fix some of those permitting challenges, but I think there's like some bigger fundamental issues about all the different agencies that have permitting functions and how you coordinate across all of them. Because like you might get some direction from public health and then different direction from DBI, and then, there's just too many different permitting authorities for one small business owner to be able to cut through all of that.
Yeah. There's also a discussion about conversions for offices because there is so much space to residential space. That's kind of a tough discussion, I feel like, because they might be used in the future, but also I've heard a lot of discussions about how the floor plates don't quite work, or the architects have to work really hard to make sure that everybody has windows and what they need. How easy or hard is it to have that discussion about conversions when buildings weren't necessarily built for residential, they're built for office?
Yeah, it doesn't really work for every building. So we worked with Gensler to do an assessment of the building stock in downtown San Francisco. And interestingly, San Francisco ranks above a lot of other cities because we have a lot of buildings that actually are good candidates, because there's like historic buildings. They don't have like giant floor plates. It's not like the federal buildings in DC. Yeah. They're just so massive and horizontal rather than vertical.
Right.
So there are actually some good, I think it was over 35% of the buildings that were good candidates. The problem is the economics of it. It's just really, really expensive to do any kind of construction in San Francisco. The encouraging thing is that on a per unit basis for a high rise, it costs about $1.2 million to build a new high rise. For these conversions, it was considerably lower. It was more like $800,000 per unit. So it's still difficult to make the math work. For sure. But we did some financial analysis with help from HRNA and Emerald Fund and Sylvan Development Group to look at the math behind it. And what we found was there are levers that the city can pull. And actually, it's great because they've actually started to make those changes. So they recently waived the transfer tax through a voter measure for those kinds of projects. They're about to implement a new tax increment financing funding source to be able to help pay for the gap, with the idea that these buildings, when they're obsolete, have a really low tax basis. When they convert, they have a higher tax basis. And so that increment can be recaptured and put into the project as a subsidy. And then the third thing is the inclusionary waiver on these buildings. That isn't because we don't think affordable housing is important, but there are options for creating some affordability at the district level instead of trying to create that requirement for every single individual building. And there are a lot of benefits to not having, all that vacancy sitting there for a very long time. And so I think all of those tools that are now starting to come into play will hopefully start to make those projects pencil.
I also want to ask you about the interaction between BART and Muni and downtown, because it's a really important confluence between the two and how they are synergistic. But also, we also ask BART and Muni to do a lot about, the homelessness problem. I'm wondering how we can address a lot of those things, and not just making BART and Muni responsible for all those quality of life issues, but making them actual partners and trying to revive downtown.
Yeah, it's hard to talk about downtown revitalization without acknowledging this kind of fundamental problem with transit service that we're faced with. Because if these operators don't get funded and we don't solve for the fiscal cliff, we're not going to be able to have a thriving downtown. It's really hard to ask people to come back to the office or mandate people coming back to the office if there's like one BART train an hour. So I think that there are different strategies that can be put into place on like the public realm and kind of creating a better sense of place that will benefit some of our transit agencies and transit ridership. I think a lot of the ridership experience part of things will probably get addressed if you have a more vibrant downtown environment, because I think it's all related. Mm-hmm. I think the sense of like when people don't feel like taking the train, partly it's because maybe the train's not full enough. And so you feel kind of weird. And maybe there's that one person who is not following the rules and you were just there with that one other person. When you have a lot more robust ridership, it makes people feel better about being on the train. So it's a little bit circular.
Yeah.
The extent to which you can make downtown an environment where it's not just about work, but also there are other reasons to be there, I think that helps get people back downtown and helps people make the trip to the office. Because then they'll go to First Thursdays or they're going to go to, a gallery opening. They're going to do other things downtown that aren't just about work.
Yeah. And there's also kind of this, not a mismatch, but like you need a lot of service to bring people downtown, but you also need a lot of downtown to create the service. And so funding that is going to be crucial. And there's been a lot of discussion about what New York's doing with congestion pricing, but also, I've seen people that aren't really into the pricing thing. So they're like, well, why don't we just do what Paris did and like start restricting vehicles? But then you're going to have a lot of arguments from folks that are like, well, if we restrict vehicles, then we can't bring our downtown back. So it's kind of like the chicken and egg problem, fighting with people who have this windshield perspective, but also people who believe that we really do need all this service to support our downtown.
Yeah, and it's about all the trade-offs.
Yeah.
I mean, I would like to see some evidence-based decision-making on that front, like what actually does draw people into the downtown, and also people, not cars, right? So you could have a lot of cars going through a place. You think about almost any highway that has a ton of cars flowing through.
Have a lot of cars coming off
it
the
doesn't
big
necessarily help the businesses.
Right.
You could have lots of empty parking lots for suburban malls, but those malls are not thriving. So I think we need to kind of dig a little bit deeper into what are the true access challenges. And there might be, there are like some loading challenges that some small businesses may need. There are some passenger drop-off pickup challenges that we might need to think about. But I also think we want to weigh that against like what actually is going to be helpful to creating more foot traffic and more of a sense of place. I think when you have too much infrastructure for the population, that's also a mismatch.
Right.
So I think sometimes the congestion is actually really helpful for retail and for getting people to stop and look around and watch what's around them. If you can just get people to the place where they can park their car and then experience it. That's maybe one set of people that isn't being served enough right now in San Francisco. But I would like to see more evidence of what is actually needed and where the gaps are instead of just going on instinct, which I think is sometimes
that's often
what happens.
happens.
Especially when you're talking about cars.
Squeaky wheels, too. I mean, we were looking for a piece of furniture this last weekend, and we walked into a shop, and one of the shop owners on Valencia, he's like, if you want to come back later, it's going to be harder because the parking is going to be harder. And I was like, oh, it's fine. I walked down here. I took the bus. And he's like, you took the bus? And I was like, yeah, we took the bus to come down here to your shop. I think a lot of times they're surprised by that, but nobody really tells you if they took the bus or,
right.
or
They
walked
just
to the
complain.
place. They always complain about the parking. And so I feel like I need to make it a habit of like telling people when I come in their shop that I came there by bike or by walking or by transit, because then they start to realize, oh, that's my customer base too, not just the person who's complaining about the parking in the area.
That's so true. And I mean, I think the bike lanes that they've put into, especially south of Market, have been pretty successful. There's not as much on the north side of Market and the financial district, but yeah. I do think that's another way of trying to create more accessibility. It doesn't all have to be through cars.
Or transit for that matter, right?
Right.
It can be a number of different ways. Festivals. I just read a piece by our friend Patrick Sisson talking about how the festivals are getting more expensive, so it's harder to put them on because the tents cost money and the permits cost money. And who's going to want to come sell something for a couple dollars if they have to pay so much to be a part of the system? And so festivals are getting more expensive and harder to put on, but we want to have more reasons for people to come downtown. Like, how can we make those two ends come together?
Yeah, I also hear from like some of the property owners and small businesses that festivals are great, but they're not frequent enough for you to be able to build your entire business model around it if you're on the ground floor of a
it's
building.
Not like a baseball game. Even then, like that's not enough probably too.
Yeah. So I think for me, I look at festivals as kind of an opportunity to just sort of signal to people that there's a lot of arts, culture, and entertainment opportunities in San Francisco. And to give people, like I said before, like another reason to be downtown. But I don't know if they're a replacement for having all of those office workers and tourists. So I think it's more about just like rebuilding that momentum. I think there are other things that need to happen, like those entertainment zones, for example, where you are allowed to sell alcohol and have people walk around in a particular designated area. Mm-hmm. With beverages so that you can have on the street, so that you can just remove some of the barriers so that if Front Street wants to do more events, it's easier for them to do it. You could streamline the permitting so that you don't have to go through that process every time you want to do that in the entertainment zone. So I think those kinds of strategies are really useful. You're just kind of like making it possible to do more and to do it more frequently. But I think you have to do other things to really actually bring more of like an arts, culture, and entertainment focus to downtown. And some of that is 100% about like affordability. It's just really hard for artists and performers to be in San Francisco, to be in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
It's all kind of tied together with some of the other things we're trying to do to create more housing opportunities for folks, to make it easier for people to get around so that if they do live in Oakland, but they want to do a show in San Francisco, it's easy for them to do that.
Yeah, that's another thing. Housing. We have lots of people who want to live here and should live here because they want to have access to the markets that or the people who will buy from them. The people who do the farmers markets or people that do like the arts shows. And so I don't know what my question is actually. I was thinking about
we just need more housing opportunities.
Yeah, more housing. If we could put more housing downtown, that would mean more people walking around as well. So how do we get there?
Yeah, there's a couple of things on the housing element implementation. One of them is the 82,000 units that are the state mandated goal. A lot of our pipeline units that are primarily in the eastern neighborhoods count towards that, but there are about 36,000 additional homes that need to be planned for. And it has to be realistic.
Yeah.
So it can't just be like, oh, here's a bunch of sites. We hope someday somebody wants to do housing on them. It has to be something
zoned for this, right?
Yeah. So
Magic.
It's been a really good opportunity for the city to think hard about how it wants to grow. And there's also an element of fair housing in the strategy. So affirmatively furthering fair housing rule from the Obama administration then got codified into state law. So the idea is you have to build housing in the high resource neighborhoods. These are the wealthier neighborhoods that have not seen much development at all, primarily in the northern and western side of the city. And that's where a lot of the new opportunity will be. And that's exciting because you could then see people who want to live close to Ocean Beach suddenly wanting to be in San Francisco, where maybe they weren't as excited about being in a downtown high-rise. There's just a new set of housing opportunities. Like we used to do this a lot in TOD world, right? Yeah. Like what are all the different housing typologies and community typologies? They don't all have to be super dense. They can also be this like medium density. There's just lots of different ways that people want to live and lots of different lifestyles that you can accommodate when you have more opportunities to do that and in lots of different neighborhoods. And you could do multi-generational housing. And there's just a lot of other things that can happen if you open up more land for housing.
Yeah. And the mayor had targeted, his draft anyways, has targeted those neighborhoods that have not seen or have resisted change over time.
Yeah. And, state law gives them a lot of opportunity. To some extent, it's not going to be purely discretionary. The city actually has to follow through on what it said it was going to do in its housing element to be able to stay compliant. And if it doesn't, then you have these other kind of potentially more scary things that could happen with builder's remedy, where you really are exempted from all of the local requirements.
A 500-story high-rise on Ocean Beach or something.
Yeah. And who knows if anybody would actually build that. But I think having that as...
I kind of want to see what happens. So something, because I feel like all the houses out there are all, 1-2-story fairy tale houses that, aside from a couple of them were built out of cable cars, there's really no historic value to them necessarily. A lot of the place was still sand dunes until the late 30s, right? So
right.
It was built for workers. I mean, I have family who built a house in Outer Mission in the teens, 20s. And so all that stuff is not the oldest, but it's also something that was built and then has never been allowed to evolve. Having more residents and allowing more housing means basically allowing more people to live here, which I think is really important, but also younger people. One of the things that I've been frustrated by lately is people will talk about their favorite bars or their favorite haunts or places that they used to go shutting down. And as people age like me, get out of going out every weekend or whatever, we age into a different level of entertainment, right? And so we need the younger people to fill in the space below us so that they can enjoy the things that we enjoyed. But if those things are gone, then it makes it harder. And so allowing younger people to live in San Francisco, allowing people who actually end up having kids here to stay here. We have a ton of amazing resources for our children. I mean, we have so many playgrounds in this area. My daughter knows every single playground within a 4-mile radius, it feels like, because she's like, oh, I want to go to Dolores Park. I want to go to Douglas Park. I want to go to Upper Douglas. I want to go to this, on the daily. And it makes me happy that we have all these resources, but I want other people to be allowed to use these resources because they're here and the housing prices make it harder for people to do that, or they'll leave, they'll move. They'll go to the East Bay. They'll leave the state, wherever else.
That's exactly right. And I think we have a lot of people who want to have an urban lifestyle who don't get heard enough. There are a lot of younger people and even, people our age who might want to be in a denser neighborhood because then it can support other things like transit. And, now I can have maybe we can actually have enough density for a coffee shop to exist here. In a lot of the neighborhoods that we're talking about, it would probably have a pretty low walk score, actually, because there's just not a lot of stuff happening right around there.
Yeah, there's a lot of areas in San Francisco. You'd be surprised, right, at how little there is, because if you do have more rooftops, then you can have more commerce. When we think about rezoning and we think about new housing, we often think about market rate housing, but there's other opportunities potentially out there for building social housing, for building public housing. I've seen some really good examples out of Montgomery County, where the county has partnered with a developer, and instead of taking the profits from this new development, they just make it into affordable units. What are some of the prospects for things that aren't market rate housing? Because I know there's a lot of folks that live in the city who are non-believers in market rate housing, or they just want to vary it where they provide housing for more, different folks through social or through public housing.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most important things that this rezoning plan does is that it opens the opportunity for multifamily housing, which means that affordable housing is possible. So a lot of times you can't use the state density bonus law, which allows you to build more units if you're creating some affordable housing, if the site is zoned for less than 5 units. So if you already have such restrictive zoning, you can't even get the affordable housing, not even in a state density bonus project. And you can't attract low-income housing tax credits to finance the project if it's too small. So there are a lot of reasons why affordable housing has had a hard time entering into the West Side. Plus, on top of that, all the NIMBYism that exists, right? There's just a lot of resistance to affordability. And without some kind of state law and some local zoning to support that, you wouldn't really have the opportunity for that affordable housing. We still have a funding issue that we need to address. So San Francisco did pass an affordable housing bond last year that helps to cover a lot of the units that were already kind of in process. But to be able to really scale this up, we're going to need a lot more funding. And so that's a challenge, particularly in this political climate that we're in at the national level and then the state deficit.
Yeah. Overall, too, there's a lot of stuff that's making it expensive, which is just like the cost of construction, too, right? I learned from redoing this basement, like that it's really expensive to just do, 1,000 square feet of remodel downstairs. And you could build like 4 houses in Texas or something for how much you paid, which is ridiculous when you think about it. But all that's because labor is expensive, because, high housing costs, because, it's the housing theory of everything, basically. It impacts everything, has its fingerprints on everything. I want to go back to Barton Muni because I think that's a really important point and something that you all brought up a couple of times in the document. We need to fund Barton Muni. I know that for me, as somebody who doesn't own a car in San Francisco, they're my lifeline to get to different parts of the city. And I find them very valuable, but only if the frequency is high.
Right.
I don't want to be waiting 20 minutes, 30 minutes for a bus when it should be 5-10 minutes waiting for a bus. I'm okay waiting for 5 to 10 minutes. Otherwise, A, I'll just walk, or B, I just won't make that trip, right? Those are the choices that we have. And so how do we figure out how to fund Muni and BART when our funding from the federal level is obviously not coming anytime soon? And then we have all these other competing resource needs from the state, locally. We'll get into, resilience funding and stuff like that later, but there's only so much money and there's so much need.
Yeah, I think it's always really hard because everybody, when it's budget season, everybody has their case to be made, right? I think what we've emphasized is that the state of California underfunds transit compared to many other states. There's just not a lot of funding coming from the state of California to our transit operators. And we really need to emphasize that transit helps to meet California's climate goals. It also helps the economy, right? Without transit, it's really hard for people to get to work, for us to be able to power all of the things that we need to be powering. There's a workforce related to the transit operations too. So there are all these implications if our transit system fails for our economy, which I think sometimes gets lost because so many people are like, well, I don't take transit, but they don't really realize that it undergirds the entire regional economy. We've also been tying it, like I said before, to the downtown recovery. It's really hard to ask people to come back to the office if they can't get there because the trains are only running once an hour. And I think unfortunately, this is kind of like the death spiral that people talk about. When you have really poor services for a public good and the quality of that public good keeps deteriorating, it makes it harder to get people to take advantage of that and to be able to make the case for continuing to fund it. So we really need to address it now because I think once you have those cuts, it's much harder to restore the service and to restore the ridership.
And we have examples of when we have good service, people use it. I mean, the ridership on the 22, the 24, on 49, which is the Van Ness BRT. I mean, those are higher than before the pandemic. And I notice the 22 is packed, right? Going through the Mission and then over to the other side of the city. And it's not going to downtown. So there's definitely a need for it. And it comes every 5 minutes. It's super frequent. And so people are using it, right? And so that's one of the things that I feel like, I don't know if we sing our praises enough of the things that we've done right to let people know that this is creating value because we've generated service and then the ridership is way up. I know some of the lines going downtown aren't as high as they were before because the downtown lost, workers and things like that. But the rest of the system, there's a lot of lines that are doing really, really well. And so one of the things I wish we would do more is like kind of sing the praises of those lines and tell people, hey, look what happens when we fund service. More people take it. It creates, more access for people to go buy things, to go to work, to connect with their friends. For me, I go to, Kaiser on Geary using the 24. Like it's like the connection between all these different things. I also have lots of crazy funding ideas. Like, why don't we just like throw stuff out? Like I know that I saw yesterday that Oregon was talking about creating their own cap and trade to match what California's done, what Washington State's done. I know that China and other countries in the Pacific Rim have cap and trade programs. Like, why don't we just create a consortium and then have like all of our agencies sell credits to the system, right? Like, why can't we fund it that way? Or I've told this story, or I've written this in my newsletter as well, is like, why can't create a public utility in San Francisco, take away PG&E's right and create that, and then set up charging infrastructure for cars, and then take all the profits from that and then use that for Muni. Like, there's all the like these pie in the sky ideas, but I wish we could like explore them and think about them. And maybe you guys have actually at SPUR, but there's like a lot of little things. Obviously, the state has a role to play. Obviously, there's funding from sales taxes, from ballot measures and things like that. But I wish we'd like explore all the options.
Yeah. And, there was the Lyft Uber tax Prop L from last year. Yeah. And which would have passed if it hadn't been for a competing ballot measure that preempted that. But that's an example of where I think voters would be supportive of trying to create some new funding sources for Muni operations and maybe even for other things, right? Like for more bikes and more multimodal options.
Yeah. Do you have like a preference on funding?
I think to the extent that you can really tie this is kind of like just a best practice. It's going to sound super general because we haven't done any like deep analysis on any of these other specific sources. But when you can attach the impact of the thing and the benefit of the thing, that's the best kind of tax, right?
Yeah.
So, for example, taxing polluters to pay for like clean energy makes a lot of sense. So to the extent we could think about that type of nexus and what those ties might be in the transportation space, congestion pricing is a really good example of that, because you are taxing the thing that is creating the impact to be able to lessen that impact and mitigate against it into the future. So I'm kind of a fan of those kinds of pricing models, but I know they're very politically fraught.
Yeah, they can be. And then finally, there's resilience and climate change and all the things that the city needs to do from that perspective. We have sea level rise that is likely to impact the waterfront. We also just have a lot of things that we can do, like electrification of buildings and stuff like that. So where are you all focused in terms of like climate change, resilience, reaching those goals?
Well, we know that there have been a lot of attacks on some of the funding sources to be able to implement some of the resilience projects. And so that is the environment that we're in. And at the same time, we have to be able to make incremental progress on these goals. I think anytime there's like an economic cycle that's not favorable, people shy away from moving forward on sustainability and resilience because they're worried. But like an earthquake, a major climate event could happen at any time. And we know from LA, rebuilding is a lot more expensive than mitigating or adapting. So if we don't figure out a way as a state and as a region to put into place some of those mechanisms, we're going to have a bigger problem down the line. And it's really hard to convey that, right? Because I think a lot of people, especially with climate stuff, it's just something will happen and then you get people's attention. But when the weather is kind of normal, there's no big crisis on the horizon, it's harder for people to make those difficult choices, but it's not really something you can wait to enact. So that's the number one principle for our resilience work is make the incremental changes that you can make. So the city just put forward a non-ductile concrete ordinance that all it does is require property owners of those buildings to do an assessment and then a voluntary retrofit. So it doesn't mandate a retrofit. But it's one step towards understanding what the risk is and then putting in place, hopefully, a financing plan so that those retrofits can happen in the future. Those kinds of things, I think we should just keep making progress on it, even though we know that it's hard to pay for some of this stuff.
Yeah. We did this basement and we did retrofit, we did a full basically upgrade. And I didn't realize this, but I just saw it randomly on the San Francisco website is like all that work can be, taken off of your property tax bill, right? Like you send them proof that you did it and then it's taken off. But you have to turn it in like within 60 days or whatever of finishing your project. And so my contractor didn't know about it. I found it. And so like maybe it's an education program that might be helpful for letting people know that these things are available, because there's so many different ways that the city allows for you to do retrofits because they want you to do it. They don't want to have your house fall down in the next earthquake. So there's like little benefits and things that are out there, but it's hard to know when those exist.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I feel like I should take that back to our team to see if there's some like capacity building we need to be doing with contractors on this kind of stuff. But Yeah, I think that's a really good example. I also feel like there are some things that people assume are costlier, and maybe they are when you first do them, but over the life of the building, it actually can save people money, right? So like transitioning to heat pumps.
That's what we did here. Yeah.
Yeah.
The IRL helped a lot, but yeah.
And there's still some incentives available for that people don't know about. And if you're a lower income person, there are a lot of other things that you can access. So there are some resources that are available, and there might be some benefits in the longer term. Again, it's like questioning assumptions, right? People are always like going by their gut, like, oh, this is going to be too expensive and it'll never work. But sometimes there are ways to make it work.
Yeah. And you can get value from it. I mean, like the solar, we got in just under net metering too. So there's that. But then also one of the reasons why I wanted to get in under net metering was because the city basically, if you go above a certain battery capacity to get more than a day of supply, you have to go through like the Public Utilities Commission and the fire department and stuff because of the possibility of a big fire from a battery, which, as we know from like the Moss Landing fire, there's some possible negative repercussions of that. Also, if the buildings are connected, like in this neighborhood where, basically my neighbor on the other side, both of our walls are somewhat shared, right? Close together buildings, old San Francisco. And so they're worried about the fire spreading if that happens. And so those things, figuring out how to make that work and allowing people to do more with the batteries than maybe they would have otherwise, sans like all the regulation and stuff that has to happen for it. It was easier to go and get in before net metering too than to try to create a system where we'd have 3 or 4 days of battery backup if something happened. So there's like little things like that too, I feel like, that are out there.
Yeah, a lot of it is just making sure that people have the tools and the information that they need to be able to make those decisions. Because I think most people, when there are a lot of people who want to do it, but they just don't know how. Yeah. So many people who want to put in an electrical panel or want to put in a heat pump, but they get overwhelmed with what is required. So a lot of what our team has been doing is like trying to remove some of the uncertainty around that. And there's also this other issue with electrical panel upgrades that are sometimes assumed to be required if you want to switch to a heat pump. Mm-hmm. And what we found is that there are a lot of ways that you can actually do this with existing electrical panels. And so that saves people tons of money and makes it a lot more affordable and possible for people. So those are the kinds of changes that can be made that are incremental progress. It's not going to totally transform everything, but those are really important pieces that we can try to attack until we have more resources to do the whole-scale transformation.
Yeah. If we don't have batteries available for people in their individual houses, it would be good to set up microgrids or some sort of like network where PG&E, or if we did have a public utility, right? The city was its own public utility. You could take a piece of property every 10th parcel or in a neighborhood and turn it into a battery center, and then have all of the solar panels flood into that and then give it back at night. The onus wouldn't have to be on every individual property owner. It could be, a network thing. And so little things like that, totally. Just thinking about the network as a whole and the grid would be super helpful from electrifying the whole place, the whole neighborhood, the whole city, and making sure that we're more efficient and more sustainable. So what are you excited about? What is the thing that you think that the mayor might adopt from this list of of big ideas, which obviously is going to take more than 100 days to do a lot of these things, but getting the ball rolling anyways?
Well, I feel like this whole governance thing is in the zeitgeist. Everybody is trying to figure out with scarcer resources. And also there's this whole thing about like blue cities and how they're not run efficiently. And so we have made it so difficult and expensive to build housing or to get things done. Whether or not you totally believe that argument, I do think that there are a lot of things that don't work super well in government and that we can improve people's lives by addressing those issues. And I think the mayor is really interested in pursuing those. So he did reorganize his office based on some of our recommendations to have these different chiefs of different policy areas. And the idea there was to create more coordination and decision making be a little bit easier when you have, 50 something departments under you.
Yeah. Sounds like 29 transit agencies.
Yeah. So at least, there's been some receptiveness on that side. They've started to take on this permitting question. So I think that there's a lot of space for us to actually do some big things and hopefully not just like tweak things at the margins or create a new section of the maze that's just for certain kinds of projects, but like actually a whole scale reform process could happen. I think we could do charter reform during this administration.
Well, let's see what happens. Where can folks find out more about what y'all are doing and maybe download this paper?
Well, we are a membership organization, so we always encourage people who care about what we do to join SPUR.
I am a member.
And you are a member. So spur.org/join. We have membership levels for students that are very accessible. We have everything from $35 to $10,000. So we try to create space for everyone. And that allows you to come to a lot of our events. A lot of our engagement opportunities are also open to the public, even if you're not a member. So you can come by the Urban Center and check out. We have an exhibition right now on the ground floor on sea level rise. We have a lot of events that happen in our space. And if you go on our website, you can see all of the things that are on the calendar. You can also access a lot of our publications and articles. Right now, we're doing a lot on the topic of budgets. For Oakland and for San Francisco, we're doing a lot of work on governance, as I mentioned before, downtown, housing, transportation, all of it. So that's all on our website.
And in September, there'll be trivia night here, and we'll announce something when it gets closer, but stay tuned for that as well.
That's great.
Yeah.
Looking forward to that.
Awesome. Well, Sujata, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. Sign up for our 18-year-old daily newsletter by visiting TheOverheadWire.com or check the show notes for other cool merch and opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find the show at its original home, usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.